It is late August in the year 1944, deep inside a concealed German field repair depot hidden beneath the dense canopy of the Normandy bocage. The air is thick with the smell of scorched diesel heavy grease and the unmistakable metallic tang of burnt steel. A senior German field mechanic stands motionless in the mud, staring intently at the shattered rear hull of a captured American M4 Sherman tank. He is not looking at the penetration hole left by a high-velocity armor-piercing shell. He is not examining the Ford GAA V8 engine or the vertical volute spring suspension system. His eyes are locked onto a crude rusted ammunition tin that has been violently and messily welded directly onto the rear armor plate of the tank. Inside this makeshift metal box sits an olive drab plastic object attached to a tangled mess of low-grade copper wires. It is a standard issue E8 infantry field telephone. The mechanic wipes the grime from his face and frantically flips through his pristine, meticulously printed Wehrmacht Ordnance identification manuals. There is no blueprint for this. There is no official schematic, no factory stamp of approval, and no logical engineering reason for a delicate piece of communication equipment to be exposed to the elements on the outside of a combat vehicle. To the highly trained mind of a German engineer, this crude modification is an absolute abomination. It is a direct insult to the rigid perfectionist doctrine of German tank design. Yet, as he traces the dirty copper wire routing straight from the telephone through a drilled hole into the internal intercom system of the Sherman, a cold wave of realization washes over him. He is looking at the exact reason why his perfectly engineered Panzer divisions are being systematically slaughtered in the hedgerows. History books have spent decades obsessing over the undeniable armor thickness of the Tiger tank and the lethal ballistics of the 88mm gun. Post-war narratives have romanticized the German armored forces as the undisputed masters of mechanized warfare, creating an illusion that they were defeated solely by sheer numerical superiority. We are going to shatter that myth today. The undeniable truth is that the most heavily armored tank in the world is completely useless if it is rendered utterly blind and deaf the moment the hatches are closed. The German war machine did not simply lose the war because it ran out of high-quality Krupp steel or synthetic petroleum. They lost because they fundamentally failed to understand the lethal mathematical equation of battlefield communication. This is not another dramatic retelling of frontline heroism or a simple comparison of muzzle velocities. This is a forensic audit of mechanical pragmatism. We are going to examine the exact moment when the rigid ideological arrogance of the Third Reich collided with the ruthless improvisational logic of the American industrial war machine. We will tear apart the doctrinal trap that doomed the Panzer crews and reveal how a $10 spool of copper wire defeated the most sophisticated armored predators on the planet. To understand the sheer panic this telephone induced in the German High Command, we must first drive the first nail into the coffin of German armored doctrine. We must examine the core trap of their own design. The foundational philosophy of the German Panzer forces was built upon the concept of the elite mechanized knight. The tank crew was viewed as a self-contained apex predator operating within an impenetrable steel fortress. German engineers poured millions of man-hours into developing sophisticated internal optics, gyroscopic compasses, and highly advanced radio systems meant exclusively for tank-to-tank communication. They built a flawless ecosystem for the armored elite. However, this doctrine contained a fatal and completely invisible blind spot. It created an absolute caste system on the battlefield. The men inside the tanks were the undisputed kings of the battlefield, while the infantrymen, slogging through the mud outside, were viewed merely as secondary support elements. In the minds of the German tactical planners, a lowly foot soldier had absolutely no business issuing tactical directives to a highly trained panzer commander. Therefore, they intentionally engineered their tanks without any direct physical interface for the infantry to communicate with the crew inside. When a German infantry squad was pinned down by hidden machine gun fire, they could not simply pick up a phone and tell the tank where to shoot. They had to rely on a convoluted and terrifyingly slow chain of command. The infantry squad leader had to crawl back under heavy fire to find a field radio operator. That operator would transmit a distress call back to the infantry battalion command's post. The infantry command post would then have to relay the coordinates to the armored battalion command post. Finally, the armored commander would broadcast the target location down to the individual tank via the dedicated armored radio network. This bureaucratic nightmare of radio relays was a masterpiece of organizational structure on paper. But in the chaotic, bloody reality of a close quarters firefight, this process took an agonizing amount of time. It could take 5 minutes, or it could take 15 minutes. In the brutal mathematics of urban combat or dense jungle warfare, a 5-minute delay is not just an inconvenience. It is a literal death sentence. By the time the Panzer commander finally received the radio order and rotated his heavy turret to face the threat, the battlefield had already changed. The enemy anti-tank gun had already repositioned, or worse, the entire German infantry squad requesting the fire support had already been wiped out. The German tank commander remained perfectly safe inside his armored cocoon, blissfully unaware of the slaughter happening just 30 feet away from his steel hull. The elite German crew was fighting one war while their own infantry was fighting an entirely different one. They were completely disconnected from the immediate tactical reality of the ground. This was not a failure of technology. It was a catastrophic failure of ideology. The German military apparatus had successfully engineered the ultimate fighting machine, but they had deliberately isolated it from the very men it was supposed to protect. The mechanics staring at the Sherman in the Normandy depot begins to understand the horrifying implications of the crude wire running from the infantry telephone to the internal tank radio. The Americans had completely bypassed the bureaucratic chain of command. They had erased the class divide between the armored elite and the disposable foot soldier. They had weaponized the concept of instantaneous feedback. The mechanic realizes that while his country is busy designing heavier armor and bigger guns, the enemy has fundamentally rewritten the rules of engagement with a piece of scrap metal and a civilian communication device. This rusty box welded to the rear plate is not just a modification. It is a physical manifestation of a military system that prioritizes immediate survival over theoretical perfection. We must now plunge into the terrifying reality of the frontline German infantrymen to fully comprehend the mechanism of this tactical deafness. Imagine being a heavily armed Panzer grenadier pinned down by intense enemy machine gun fire in the rubble of a ruined French village. Just 10 feet away from your position sits a massive Panzer Mark IV. It is a formidable machine armed with a high-velocity cannon capable of obliterating the enemy position in a single shot. But you cannot talk to it. The steel monster is completely deaf to the chaos unfolding right outside its armored shell. The roar of its Maybach engine drowns out the screams of the wounded and the staccato rhythm of incoming fire. To get the attention of the tank commander, you are forced to engage in a desperate and often suicidal physical act. German infantrymen were routinely reduced to throwing rocks or empty brass casings against the thick steel of the turret, hoping the pinging sound would be heard over the engine noise. If the rocks failed, a soldier had to break cover sprint through a hail of bullets, climb onto the slick armored engine deck, and physically bang on the commander's hatch with the butt of his rifle. This primitive method of communication forced the Panzer commander to make a lethal choice. He either remained safely buttoned up inside his blind steel box, rendering his vehicle tactically useless, or he unlatched the heavy steel cupola and exposed his head and shoulders to the battlefield. The moment that hatch opened, the commander became the absolute priority target for every Allied sniper rifleman and machine gunner within 1,000 yards. The mortality rate for German tank commanders who were forced to operate unbuttoned in urban environments was catastrophically high. This was the gruesome reality of the German communication paradox. The perfectly engineered command hierarchy had created a system where speaking to a friendly vehicle required an act of sheer suicidal bravery. The mechanic looking at the captured Sherman begins to mentally overlay the complex blueprints of a Tiger tank onto the crude American modification. The Tiger was a masterpiece of mechanical engineering. It possessed overlapping road wheels, a complex dual steering system, and optics crafted by the finest glass makers in Europe. Yet, despite its terrifying complexity, it completely lacked a simple physical interface for the men bleeding in the dirt beside it. The engineers in Berlin had anticipated every conceivable armored threat, but they had completely forgotten the human element of combined arms warfare. Now we must examine the artisan hack that shattered this German paradigm. The solution to this fatal disconnect did not originate in high-level Pentagon briefing rooms or sterile engineering laboratories. It was born in the mud, the blood, and the sheer desperation of the front line, independently discovered by Allied forces facing the same lethal problem. American Marines first improvised it in the Pacific jungles of Bougainville in late 1943. British tankers developed similar systems, with Churchill tanks receiving factory-installed infantry telephones as standard equipment by 1943. By the summer of 1944 in Normandy, both American and British tanks were equipped with these phones, each army arriving at the same brutal solution through parallel innovation. The German Panzer forces, bound by rigid operational doctrine, never developed this critical capability. While Allied tank crews welded field telephones to their hulls, German infantry continued throwing rocks at steel turrets, hoping to be heard over the roar of Maybach engines. If a system did not work, the American soldier would simply hack it until it did. The process was brutal, practical, and highly unofficial. An armored mechanic would grab an empty metal ammunition tin, usually an empty .30 caliber box, and weld it roughly to the rear armor plate of the Sherman tank, right next to the exhaust deflectors. Inside this makeshift housing, they would stuff a standard EE-8 field telephone encased in heavy leather or bakelite. The true stroke of mechanical genius, however, was in the wiring. They drilled a small hole directly through the hull armor and ran a crude parallel wire straight from the field telephone into the tank's internal BC-600 intercom system. They bypassed the radio completely. There were no frequencies to tune, no encryption codes to manage, and no radio operators to act as middlemen. When an American infantryman picked up the handset of the welded telephone, his voice was piped directly and instantly into the headset of the tank commander sitting inside the turret. This drives the second nail into the coffin of the German operational doctrine. It highlights the profound difference in the logistical and cultural flexibility between the two war machines. If a German field mechanic had attempted to drill an unauthorized hole through the Krupp steel of a Panzer hull and weld a telephone to its rear, he would have faced swift court-martial for destruction of state property. The German system punished deviation from the blueprint. The Allied systems, both American and British, took a fundamentally different approach. While the Americans encouraged bottom-up field improvisation, the British integrated the lesson into factory production, with Churchill tanks rolling off assembly lines with telephone boxes already installed. Both approaches worked. Both saved lives. The common thread was pragmatic flexibility over doctrinal purity. The United States military was fundamentally an organization that accepted a high degree of imperfection and improvisation as long as it delivered a functional result. This ugly, rusted telephone box was not a violation of American doctrine. It was the ultimate expression of it. The American High Command understood that the men dying in the dirt usually knew how to solve immediate tactical problems far better than the generals sitting behind desks thousands of miles away. We must now transition from the theoretical realm of engineering into the violent reality of the clash. Let us examine the ultimate real-world test of this improvised interface in the claustrophobic nightmare of the Normandy bocage. The hedgerow country of northern France was an agricultural labyrinth designed centuries ago to enclose livestock. It consisted of massive sunken dirt lanes, flanked by thick, impenetrable walls of ancient roots, heavy earth, and dense vegetation. Visibility was routinely reduced to less than 50 yards, making it an absolute death trap for any armored vehicle. A tank operating in the bocage was completely blind, rendering its highly engineered long-range optics and heavy frontal armor utterly irrelevant. The German defenders understood this geographic advantage perfectly and seeded the hedgerows with hidden anti-tank guns, camouflaged machine gun nests, and lethal teams of infantry armed with the devastating Panzerfaust. The standard German ambush tactic in this environment was a masterclass in stealth and sudden overwhelming violence. They would allow the American armored column to advance deep into the sunken road before striking the lead and trail vehicles simultaneously. This would effectively trap the rest of the convoy in a burning steel cage where they could be picked off one by one. Now picture the German mechanic in the repair depot reading the frantic after-action reports filed by the surviving ambush commanders. The reports detail a terrifying shift in the tactical behavior of the American armored columns that completely defied German mathematical models. A German squad armed with a short-range Panzerfaust is perfectly concealed behind a thick wall of roots, waiting for the massive side profile of an M4 Sherman to expose itself. They are perfectly silent, perfectly hidden, and mathematically guaranteed a lethal kill because they are within 30 meters of the target. But suddenly, the dynamic changes in a way the German tactical commanders cannot logically process. An American infantryman advancing cautiously behind the tracks of the Sherman spots the slight glint of a steel helmet or a minor disturbance in the foliage. Under normal doctrinal circumstances, he would have to scream over the roaring engine or throw a colored smoke grenade to mark the target, hoping the buttoned-up tank crew would interpret the signal correctly. Instead, he simply unhooks the handset from the rusted ammunition box welded to the rear armor plate. He presses the receiver to his face and whispers a few calm syllables directly into the ear of the tank commander through the intercom. Target right 30 o'clock, 100 feet low behind the thick oak tree. Within 2 seconds, the heavy turret of the Sherman violently rotates 90 degrees. The massive 75mm main gun lowers its elevation and fires a high explosive shell directly into the hidden German position before the Panzerfaust operator can even steady his aim or pull the trigger. The carefully planned ambush is completely obliterated in a deafening shockwave of fire and splintered wood. The American infantryman simply hangs up the phone, and the steel beast continues its slow, methodical advance without ever breaking its momentum. The German field reports describing these specific encounters are filled with genuine psychological panic and profound military confusion. The surviving German soldiers returning from the front lines were utterly bewildered by the supernatural reaction time of the American tanks. They reported to their superiors that the Sherman crews must possess some sort of secret experimental radar system capable of looking through solid earth and vegetation. Some reports even wildly speculated that the American vehicles were equipped with advanced acoustic sensors that could detect a man breathing behind a hedgerow. They could not comprehend how a buttoned-up tank could instantly pinpoint a camouflaged target in a dense forest. The German mechanic holding the muddy telephone wire in the depot realizes with cold clarity that there is no radar. There is no acoustic sensor, and there is no technological miracle. There is only a direct, unbroken physical line of communication between the human eye outside the tank and the heavy weapon inside the tank. The Americans had successfully merged the situational awareness of a highly mobile infantryman with the devastating firepower of 30 tons of mobile artillery. They had effectively created a synthetic, multi-eyed organism that reacted to threats with the speed of a single central nervous system. The German Panzer doctrine relied heavily on isolated mechanical perfection, while the American approach relied on integrated human feedback. The German tank was designed as a lone wolf stalking its prey. The American tank, equipped with this primitive phone, became the deadly, heavily armed center of a highly coordinated swarm intelligence. A German infantryman spotting a threat had to navigate a bureaucratic labyrinth of radio relays to call for heavy fire support. An American infantryman simply had to push a physical button and speak into a plastic handset. In a combat environment where life and death are measured in fractions of a second, that massive difference in communication latency is the sole deciding factor between victory and absolute annihilation. The combat loop of observe, orient, decide, and act was compressed from minutes down to a single second. This crude modification bypassed the entire command structure and handed the power of a tank's main gun directly to the lowest-ranking private in the dirt. To the rigid German military mind, giving a private the authority to direct a tank was anarchy. To the pragmatic American military mind, it was the most efficient way to clear a road and keep the advance moving forward. We must now step back from the blood-soaked mud of the hedgerows and open the cold, unforgiving ledger of industrial war. To truly grasp the magnitude of the German defeat, we have to analyze this conflict not as a clash of ideologies, but as a ruthless mathematical equation. War, at its absolute core, is the most brutal accounting system ever devised by mankind. In this deadly ledger, the currency is measured in steel petroleum explosive filler and human blood. Let us examine the balance sheet of the Third Reich. The German military-industrial complex was obsessed with the pursuit of absolute technological supremacy. They poured their dwindling national resources into designing the most terrifying and complex fighting machines the world had ever seen. Consider the mighty King Tiger tank, a leviathan of the battlefield, weighing nearly 70 tons and protected by sloped armor plates so thick that almost no Allied weapon could penetrate it from the front. Building just one of these mechanical monsters required an astronomical investment of capital. It consumed hundreds of thousands of Reichsmarks, required vast quantities of increasingly rare strategic materials like tungsten and molybdenum, and demanded thousands of hours of highly skilled, specialized labor. The precision optics alone were masterpieces of optical engineering crafted by elite technicians in sterile factories. The final product was an undeniable triumph of heavy engineering. However, in the unforgiving mathematics of combat, this massive investment was entirely negated by a catastrophic failure in situational awareness. When deployed into the dense urban ruins of Aachen or the thick forests of the Ardennes, this magnificent 70-ton dreadnought became a slow-moving blind target. Because the German engineers had refused to include a simple communication link to the infantry outside the King Tiger, could be easily outflanked and destroyed by a hidden infantryman holding a cheap, disposable anti-tank weapon. A multi-million-dollar investment was repeatedly liquidated in seconds because the elite crew inside could not hear the frantic warnings of their own infantry standing just a few meters away. Now let us examine the American side of the ledger. The American military-industrial complex did not seek to build the perfect invincible tank. They sought to build a reliable, adaptable machine that could be mass-produced, shipped across an ocean, and maintained by a 19-year-old mechanic with basic tools. The M4 Sherman tank was not the most heavily armored vehicle on the battlefield, and its gun was often outmatched in a direct frontal duel with a German heavy tank. But the Sherman was modular, and it was backed by an industrial supply chain that operated with terrifying efficiency. When the frontline troops encountered the fatal visibility problem in the bocage, they did not submit a formal request for a newly engineered vehicle. They solved the problem with the refuse of the battlefield. Let us conduct a forensic audit of the specific object that shifted this balance of power. The EE-8 field telephone was an unremarkable piece of standard issue communication equipment. It was housed in a simple canvas or leather case containing a basic hand-cranked magneto generator, a dry cell battery, and a Bakelite handset. Its total monetary value was less than $20 US. The wire used to connect it was standard low-grade copper communication wire, the kind unspooled by the mile by signal corps linemen every single day. The box that protected it from the elements was often nothing more than a discarded .30 caliber ammunition tin salvaged from a scrap pile. This entire modification cost absolutely nothing in terms of strategic military budget. It required no specialized engineering degree to install. A combat engineer with a portable welding torch and basic wire stripping tools could complete the entire installation in less than 30 minutes. Yet this incredibly cheap primitive modification instantly transformed the Sherman tank into a highly responsive multi-sensor weapons platform. It allowed the tank to act as a precise surgical instrument rather than a blunt, blind instrument of destruction. The return on investment for this $10 modification was mathematically incalculable. It saved hundreds of millions of dollars in destroyed armored vehicles, and more importantly, it preserved the lives of countless highly trained tank crews. But the true terrifying power of this artisan hack was not just its effectiveness on a single tank. It was the systemic reaction of the American logistical bureaucracy that truly doomed the German forces. When news of this unauthorized field modification reached the upper echelons of the American Ordnance Department, the generals did not react with disciplinary action. They did not convene a multi-year engineering committee to study the aerodynamic impact of a welded box on the rear hull. They did not order the troops to dismantle the telephones and return the vehicles to their factory specifications. Instead, the American system recognized the brilliant pragmatic logic of the front-line soldier and immediately absorbed it into the official machinery of war. Within a matter of weeks, the massive industrial factories back in the United States completely updated their assembly lines. They began producing standardized official field telephone kits designed specifically to be mounted on the exterior of armored vehicles. These kits were crated up, loaded onto Liberty ships, and sent across the Atlantic Ocean by the tens of thousands. What started as a desperate unauthorized hack by a few terrified soldiers in a French ditch was rapidly weaponized and mass-produced on an industrial scale. The American war machine possessed an organizational elasticity that the rigid authoritarian structure of the Third Reich simply could not comprehend, let alone replicate. The German mechanic staring at the rusted telephone box in the repair depot finally understands the full terrifying scope of his enemy. He realizes that his nation is fighting a war of intricate, rigid perfection against an enemy that operates with chaotic, adaptable efficiency. The German system punishes deviation and relies on the slow dictation of orders from the top down. The American system rewards innovation and rapidly scales up the brutal solutions discovered from the bottom up. In the cold ledger of industrial war, adaptability will always bankrupt rigidity. The German High Command had focused entirely on the thickness of their armor and the velocity of their shells, while completely ignoring the speed at which vital information travels on the battlefield. The German mechanic standing in the muddy depot slowly closes his leather-bound inspection notebook. He looks one last time at the crude rusted box welded to the rear of the Sherman. The realization is absolute and it is devastating. The Third Reich had engineered the most terrifying armored predators in human history, but they had placed those predators inside a vacuum. They had built a military system that worshipped the machine and isolated the man. The American war machine, in stark contrast, viewed the machine simply as a heavy tool designed to serve and protect the man standing in the dirt. That fundamental difference in philosophy is what ultimately shattered the German armored forces in the West. It was not a matter of a heavier gun or thicker armor plate. It was the terrifying speed of an integrated combined arms network where a private with a cheap telephone possessed more immediate tactical power than an elite panzer commander with a state-of-the-art optical sight. This story forces us to look past the shiny metallic mythology of World War II and confront the grim human reality of the front line. We must remember the infantrymen, the grunts who slogged through the mud and bled in the hedgerows. They were the ones who paid the ultimate price for the strategic blunders of their commanders. The invention of the grunt phone was not a grand strategic directive from a brilliant general. It was a desperate plea for survival from the men at the absolute bottom of the military hierarchy. That simple $10 modifications saved the lives of tens of thousands of American soldiers. It allowed them to call down the wrath of a 30-ton steel beast exactly when and where they needed it most. Now, I want to hear your perspective on this clash of ideologies. Do you think the German obsession with mechanical perfection blinded them to the reality of warfare, or were they simply overwhelmed by American industrial volume regardless of these tactical adaptations? Share your thoughts, historical insights, or family stories in the comments below. If you found this forensic audit of military history valuable, make sure to subscribe and join us for the next investigation. Because sometimes the greatest military blueprints in the world are ultimately defeated by a dirty piece of copper wire and a soldier who refuses to die.